Hello, everyone. Welcome to session 2. So here we have the king priest seizing authority for himself, this coming directly from Genesis 3, which hopefully, if we're familiar with this passage, we know this is when the serpent infiltrates the garden and tempts the woman first, with Adam standing very close in proximity. And when the woman hands the fruit to her husband, it wasn't that she had to transport it at a great distance to get to him. He saw and heard everything that happened, presumably, and then with that, failed to enact his role as being the one who was supposed to work and watch over the garden, or in the terms of Numbers 18, to work and to guard the temple sanctuary that was this garden, and bring out or chase out the snake or execute judgment on him and kill the snake or the being that is the serpent. So what I'm doing here is I just want to march you through this, going from the upper left corner of the screen down to the bottom. And then I've tried to divide this up into different quadrants here. So that way there's one quadrant on top, then the second on the bottom, and then the one on the far right of the screen. And this is the interplay here as you're going through each of these. They are lined up together like that. I just chose not to create those connections so that way the slide is not even more busy than it already is. So as I walk you through this, I'm just going to read a few of these from each of these different categories to give you the general feel of what we're talking about. So the woman saw that the tree was good, delightful, desirable for obtaining wisdom. This is so important for us to make sure we're capitalizing on, as goes the fact that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is to be understood as a source of wisdom itself. It's not the embodiment of evil, because God would not have put something like that in the garden. But as we walk through the experiment of what happened here, the king priest that God had created, i.e., Adam, he rejects the wisdom that Yahweh offered him to rule this entire creation that God had made from the garden, and then all of it together as he expands the garden with God's help. That's the reason the tree of life is there, is because he's supposed to trust the Lord and walk with God in what God is defining as right and wrong, versus the man choosing for himself what is right and wrong. But then in the process, he will then be able to discern between good and evil, because now evil has presented itself. This being has questioned what God has said and what the human's understanding of it really is, right? And so with that, he's even not only calling it into question, but then twisting and perverting those words. So evil is afoot, and the man could have chosen to execute judgment upon that. To do so would to clearly dispel that he knows the difference between right and wrong, good and evil. But that being said, that's clearly not what happened. And so because of that, that's the consequence. But also what I'm really wanting to illustrate here is the fact that the woman saw, and this word now becomes a pattern that happens so many times in many of the stories that transpire through Judges, but also other books of both the Torah and the ones that immediately follow the Torah, such as in Genesis 6:2, when the sons of God, i.e., angels apparently, see the sons of men as being beautiful, and angels rebel. They leave their first estate and they pervert the seed of women, and do so, or in doing so, create demon spawn. And then later on in the story of Abraham, when Pharaoh's officials saw that Sarai was so beautiful, they praised her to Pharaoh. And then, of course, the covenant is threatened, because the covenant is supposed to see children brought forth through the womb of Sarai, later to be known as Sarah, when God opens her womb so that life is created there, making it very clear that God has been orchestrating this covenant and will faithfully see it through. Abraham's help is not needed in this. And we could go on with the rest of these examples, but I think you get the point. If you read the gray block followed by the green block, you'll see that. And I think it's important for us to draw these patterns out for our students. And I would reference you back to the introductory video as to why this is the case. No doubt we could easily spend all of our lesson time on Genesis chapter 3 and the sinfulness of the first man and woman and their questioning of what God said and how that might apply to us. But I would think we would also lose a golden opportunity here to try to lay down how this kind of thing is amplified over and over and over again through Scripture, because we're not going to hit on every one of these lessons as we walk through the Gospel Projects portion of the Old Testament over the next 18 months. So laying out those patterns now can also help our students for the future when we do touch on some of these stories, right? So we get down to the next orange block. God says, as part of the curse, I will put hostility between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. So in each of these other blocks that come after this, we understand that final victory is what is promised to the seed of the woman, and the seed of the serpent is constantly being judged, such that when we get to the next gray block, the Lord struck Pharaoh with severe plagues because of Abram's wife. So in this moment, Pharaoh, even though it would seem like he might have been a little innocent in the sense that he had no idea Sarai was Abram's wife, he was lied to, apparently. There was deception at play. So clearly, Abram has some issues here that he's got to work out with the Lord, and it brought an injustice upon the people of Egypt. However, Pharaoh is acting like the serpent in a sense that he's gobbling up another woman to add to his harem. And that's clearly not the pattern that God had established in creation when we see the descendants of Cain, i.e., Lamech or evil Lamech, who takes two women to be his wives, and then, of course, openly mocks God after he kills a man for simply wounding his pride. Or we see here in Exodus 14 the Pharaoh of that story, and he is destroyed along with his army in the Red Sea, and they were the serpent who slithered after Israel in the wilderness and, of course, will crush in the water. Or Amalek that met Israel in the wilderness and attempted to try to thwart them there, loot, pillage all that they possessed and brought out of Egypt with them, take their women and children off to be their slaves and so forth, and decimate these people, leaving them for dead in the wilderness, or at least all of those that they killed. And because of that, they were crushed. And God promises he will continue to make war with Amalek for every generation until they're annihilated. Or the coalition of kings in Canaan that Joshua defeated, those who centered around Jerusalem and from Jerusalem coalesced together to try to stop the Israelite advance after the defeat of both Jericho and Ai. And they were trounced in one battle. And with that, it crippled the entire southern portion of Canaan. And notice here that when you actually walk through that story, they were all put to death by this, not symbolic in the sense that it is certainly literal, but symbolic in the fact that it relates back to Genesis chapter 3, with Joshua telling the people to move the rocks away from the cave that were holding these kings prisoner within, take them out, lay them on the ground, and put their boots over their necks to show that these serpentine kings were now crushed underfoot. So we could go on, but I think you get the story. I don't want to go too much into David and Goliath at the bottom of the screen because we'll just get lost in that. And then the Lord sent him, the first image bearer or king priest, away, and then stationed the cherubim. So with that, the king priest is cast from the garden to them. And of course, when we move further, the Lord scatters them throughout all the earth in Genesis chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel. So what's happening here is this relates back to this block here, when they saw that the food was desirable for obtaining wisdom, and of course to satisfy their fleshly urges and their hunger needing to be satiated, they chose to seize wisdom to define right and wrong for themselves. And with that, they suffer the consequences. And there are many stories after this like that, such as the Tower of Babel story, when they try to define right and wrong again, building a new cosmic mountain to unite heaven and earth together. And in the process, God will have nothing of it, judges them, scatters them all over the face of the earth, forcing them to fulfill what he said would happen as a blessing to Noah. Now it's seemingly a curse. Or the humans that were privileged to live after the flood. Sorry, that connects with what was above it. Or what happens in Exodus 32, when those Israelites rebelled against God and worshiping the golden calf. And so by breaking the covenant, they incur Yahweh's wrath. Now, they thought what they were doing was right. They made an image unto the God who they claimed brought them out of Egypt, who was the very God that they covenanted with just a few verses earlier. But in the process of it all, they clearly violated the command. And by virtue of that, thousands lost their lives that night. So hopefully this has helped instruct in a way to send some ripples out further away from this story into deeper portions of Scripture to show how this pattern develops and how it becomes a basis by which we are to understand the construction of the Old Testament, all stemming back from this story. Because the story itself is not there to just simply show us how sin finds its origins. That's a part of it, but it's certainly not the only thing in the mechanics of the story itself. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in our next session.